You're listening to the Art of Procurement episode 129.
Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
The Art of Procurement is brought to you by PalmBridge. PalmBridge harnesses the power of the platform economy to help you access the expertise, the market intelligence, and the enabling technology that you need to create supplier-enabled competitive advantage, but that was previously out of reach. And for more information, visit palmbridge.com. Hi everyone, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement. Today's a show that I've really been looking forward to for a long time, and I learned a lot from it, both in my pre-show preparation and the interview itself, including, at least for me, a couple of aha moments. And I'm delighted to be joined by Jack Shaw. Jack is a business technology futurist who has spent his career leading companies in numerous industries to deliver technology to find better, more efficient ways of conducting and operating their businesses. And Jack has authored 3 critically acclaimed books and numerous articles. He's delivered more than 1,000 paid keynote addresses and executive presentations across more than 20 countries, including the recent ProcureCon Indirect East conference. Jack also recently co-founded the Blockchain Executive and the American Blockchain Council. So their charter is to aggregate, interpret, and disseminate the latest information available on the blockchain protocol, including how the technology is manifested and the potential impact on businesses globally. And it's the topic of blockchain that Jack and I connected, and we connected thanks to a mutual connection at ProcureCon. I think it's fair to say that, you can't move today for reading blockchain-related articles, but to be honest, I've always been a little confused by them in terms of understanding what blockchain actually is. And I think you need to understand that before you can really understand its impact. So that's where we start. We go down to the very basics to understand what blockchain is, and then we can begin to understand what are some of the technologies that can be built upon it. And therefore, that leads to subsequent use cases and the impact within procurement and supply chain. I came away from the interview really being able to visualize a lot better what blockchain is, but the impact that it could have on us as a profession and on our companies in terms of what and how they buy. So with all that being said, let's go straight into the show. So hi everybody, and as I mentioned in my introduction, today I'm joined by Jack Shaw. Jack is a technology futurist and also co-founder of the American Blockchain Council. And I know that, Jack, you do an awful lot of other things that I kind of talked through in my introduction, but thank you for joining me. Welcome to the show.
Well, it's absolutely a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Philip. I'm looking forward to it.
No, I'm really happy that you could join me. And the first question I just wanted to go straight into is just to understand a little bit about, what you're passionate about right now.
Well, my work has always been about helping businesses understand the strategic implications of emerging technologies, how to adapt to them, how to plan for them. That's always been my lifelong passion as a career. But that wanes and waxes a little bit as emerging technologies become more widely adopted and people get, new technologies come along, and some of them are more interesting and more exciting and others are less. But at the moment, I'm particularly passionate about the implications of blockchain technology because I think it is quite simply the most important advance in business technology since the emergence of the internet and the World Wide Web, in fact, some 20 to 25 years ago.
So the purpose of the show and the context I kind of mentioned in my intro just before we roll the tape is I really want to go deeper into blockchain because I think it's one of those things that we hear a lot. We're not quite sure what's hype. We're not quite sure what's reality. We're not quite sure what to do about it. Or I'm not. Maybe I'm an outlier, but that's kind of how I come to it. So I got a bunch of questions I want to ask you about blockchain. But before we went there, I was interested to understand. So, you've talked about the fact that you help companies understand those implications of emerging technology. And I imagine over the time that you've been doing that, there's been some technologies that have surpassed expectations, some that are perhaps underwhelmed. And as you look at a technology that's emerging, what makes you think, this is something that can change the world versus this is something that, it's nice, but maybe it might not be so impactful?
That's an excellent question, and I wish I could write down the formula for that, because I would reproduce it more readily. It's on the artistic side of the art and science. But to give you a general idea, having seen a number of emerging technologies over a 30-plus year career, I begin to recognize the patterns. And I think some of the things in the patterns is there something about this technology that makes me believe that it can help bring about fundamental change in addressing problems or challenges that businesses, organizations, society as a whole have? Or is the technology which is something that, may be very handy, convenient, and become quite widely adopted, but quite simply makes it a little bit easier or faster or less expensive to do the same kinds of things that we're already doing right now anyway? And the latter, certainly can be pretty significant under certain circumstances. For example, I take a look at mobile technology. Now, for most Americans, Western Europeans, Asia Pacific, sort of the traditionally denominated first world countries, mobile certainly was a convenience, and it was an extension of the notion of ubiquitous computing, from desktop to then a laptop, which you could carry around, to actually being able to have a computer in your pocket or a tablet that could be even much more easily carried around. It clearly, if you look at many third world countries, Africa is one of the best examples of this. It was very much of a game changer in those areas, because these were areas that were already not very well wired for landlines, and it was much faster and less expensive to go in and put up cell towers. And in many of those countries, they skipped right over the traditional copper-wired landlines and went straight to mobile. So, that was hugely a game changer for society and to a certain extent for businesses in those parts of the world. So, it can play. But some of these other technologies, and up until recently, clearly the Internet and the World Wide Web was the most readily apparent example of that, change everything everywhere for everybody. And we've got a couple of more examples of that are happening now, and that's part of what I'm so excited about.
And I want to, kind of go on to blockchain, because I know you mentioned that being one of those. But is there anything that you see, like any emerging technologies that maybe are a little bit under the radar, so they're just not getting the press, but there's something that we should really keep our eye on?
Well, this is going to seem a bit ironic, because it's something people have been talking about for 30 years or more, but it's often sort of poo-pooed because it hasn't come along quite as quickly as many people were led to believe that it would, and that is artificial intelligence and various forms of artificial intelligence. For the longest time, people talked about, artificial intelligence as if suddenly completely generally intelligent, self-aware robots were going to appear on the stage, and then probably, like in the Terminator, attempt to slaughter us all. And it's simply not working that way. Robots, as are being used in manufacturing and increasingly in other areas, are becoming much more effective. But we need to have different conversations, at any rate, around the robotic capabilities of machinery and the intelligent capabilities of automated systems that may be digital but may not actually have machinery directly involved in them. At the recent ProcureCon conference that I spoke at, for example, there were a couple of other very good presentations talking about robotic process automation. So that's an example of something that applies the concepts of artificial intelligence, such tools as natural language recognition, machine learning, pattern recognition, and so forth, to bring about some pretty dramatic changes, even though you don't have anthropomorphic robots actually moving things around. You have intelligent systems moving information around much more quickly and accurately than people typically do the kinds of routine tasks that those are applied to. And where I'm excited is where a couple of different things happen. One, I've known for many years, recognized for many years, I should say, that the most exciting developments are at the intersections of these emerging technologies. So when you combine artificial intelligence with blockchain, when you combine the Internet of Things so that you can have actual direct communication between the physical world and the digital world with AI and blockchain. And then again, it's appropriate where you leverage technologies like augmented reality and even 3D printing, though that's a little more on the supply chain side than the pure sourcing and procurement side. It obviously has huge implications and will increasingly do so. So with all of these different changes coming down the road, I think there's a lot to keep an eye on. And the thing that I'm particularly excited about in the case of blockchain is it enables a lot of capabilities to fully leverage this range of other technologies that, because of the nature of the internet prior to the emergence of the blockchain, we couldn't do nearly as much with as we can now and will certainly be doing in the very near future as a result of blockchain.
So let's take a step. Well, first of all, I think it's fascinating kind of how all these things come together, and I'd actually like to explore that a little bit later on, and how the compound effect of all these different technologies can lead to something which is perhaps far and away different from what we imagine, because we think of them on a more linear basis. But before going there, I want to go into, kind of the basics a little bit around blockchain. So let's start at the very beginning. What exactly, for people who have heard the concept of blockchain, but they're not quite sure of what it is or how it works, could you just give kind of a 101 on what exactly blockchain is?
Sure. Let me try to give you as clear and simple a verbal explanation as I can. And I think to do that, if you really want to understand why blockchain is important for business, it's much more important to focus on what blockchain does rather than the technical details of how blockchain works. Now, if we've got time, I'm happy to get into a little bit of the how it works, how it does what it does. But that's a rabbit hole we could spend hours and hours going down and either totally confuse people who are not technically oriented or still not complete task for those who are. So what is it that the blockchain does that is different? And what I'm going to do is illustrate with you the most widely known example of the application of blockchain technology, which is the digital currency of Bitcoin. And first of all, there are going to be some number of your listeners who are going to say, oh my God, this has something to do with Bitcoin. That's that thing that hackers and terrorists and drug lords use to do business with one another. We don't ever want to have anything to do with that. And that's sort of a very analogous situation to some 20 years ago. I was speaking to a group about another emerging technology, the World Wide Web. And one of the executives at the meeting said, well, I certainly don't understand why I would want to have my business involved with anything that is all about college boys looking at dirty pictures online. And because unfortunately, pornography was one of the first killer apps on the web. And what happens is that criminals and others at the margins of society do tend to be the first to leverage new emerging technologies to gain a unfair advantage where that is possible to do it. So, yes, in its early days, 2009, 10, 11, maybe on into 12 a little bit, and that's about 5 years ago, Bitcoin was disproportionately used for some of those kinds of activities and still is to a certain extent, but it's becoming a much more viable alternative payment mechanism in the same way that 30 to 40 years ago, suddenly this concept of credit cards emerged to come alongside of cash and check as payment mechanisms. So how does it work? What the challenge, and the reason Bitcoin works, and for 30 years before that, there have been efforts to develop digital currencies. And none of them worked because none of them could solve what's called the double spend problem. And what that refers to is quite simply, if you and I are sharing information, if you're going to send me a PDF, or I'm going to send you a video, or you're going to send me an audio tape to review, we both perfectly well understand when we're emailing or uploading or downloading this kind of information, what we're really doing is passing copies around. If I send you a PDF, I've still got the original PDF on my computer and I can send it to somebody else. And that's just fine. That's one of the reasons why the internet and the web is such a great tool for sharing information. But when it comes to making payments, it's very important that if I'm paying you, that at the end of that process of my making a payment to you, you have the money and I don't have that money anymore. You don't want a copy of my money. You want the actual money, and you want it to be the case that you've got it and I don't have it. Because otherwise, if I'm just sending you a copy of my money, I can send a copy of the same money to lots of other people. Everybody will do the same thing, and almost immediately the money will be worthless. So how did they solve that problem? Well, the blockchain gives you several different things. It gives you, first of all, shared record that is recorded on a distributed ledger. By distributed ledger, it means there are many copies of the same ledger, the same set of records of transactions that have taken place on the blockchain. And by many copies, I mean, depending on which blockchain, and there are multiple blockchains out there, we're talking about anywhere from dozens to, in most cases, hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of what are called nodes on the internet, or computers, different sites, computers all over the world that have identical copies of what's on the blockchain.
Sorry, Jack. So it could be like a, you have an old school accounting ledger book where you have your ins and your outs, but that is actually been replicated and stored all around the world, that exact same copy. You can change one, but you can't change 10,000 versions of that.
Right, exactly. So if I want, if we say that Jack has sent one Bitcoin to Philip, which I hope you would appreciate because at the moment that would be about $1,200 US. If I were to send one Bitcoin to you, there would be a record made on the ledger that I sent not simply a Bitcoin, but Bitcoin serial number 1275, one specific Bitcoin with a unique serial number on it. And if I try to send a copy of that same Bitcoin to somebody else, all the rest of the copies of the blockchain around the world will say, wait a minute, you can't send that because you don't own it. That is now owned by Philip, and it can be confirmed all over the world. Now, if I want to send a different Bitcoin to somebody else, and it's a Bitcoin that I own, that's perfectly fine. So it's almost as if every time there was a cash transaction anywhere in the world, there was a ledger recording of the serial number of exactly which dollar bills or $20 bills or $100 bills were handed from person A to person B or entity A to entity B. So first of all, you've got a shared record that everyone can review and access, who is authorized to do so. Now, in the case of Bitcoin, anyone who's interested can be authorized to do so. But as you'll see in other applications of blockchain technology, you can control very carefully who can update information, and for that matter, who can even see it. The second piece is the record is not only shared, it is immutable. It's unchangeable, carved in stone. And we'll get back in a couple of minutes to how does that happen and how do we make that record immutable. Third is it provides, as I mentioned before, complete transparency for all those authorized. And there are basically two things you can do with information. You can update information. In other words, you can append new information that has the result of revising or, in effect, the economic result of deleting previous information. Or you can just view information without being allowed to add anything new to it. And those are capabilities that are provided for in blockchain technology. And fourth, those who are not authorized to update information may be authorized to see it, but won't be able to append new or updated information or revised information to it. And if they're not authorized to see it, they won't even be able to see it. In fact, they won't even know it's there. Or at most, they would see what amounts to gibberish and have no way of determining what is even the meaning of that information, much less be able to act on it in some kind of economic or social way. So those are the primary things that blockchain does. And then if you step back and you think about all of those implications, it means that we now have a way of trusting information that we never had before. As a result of that, we can exchange value on the internet in a way that we were never able to do before. And so that's why some people refer to blockchain as the internet of trust or the internet of value. And it's not just digital currency. And Bitcoin, while it's the most widely known and widely utilized digital currency, There are literally several hundred others of varying and decreasing degrees of use that are out there, but it's not even just currencies. It's being used already for everything from registering land titles, car titles, even voting in the country of Estonia, almost anything that requires trust verification. And so I was asked a couple of months ago if I could contribute to, and I'm looking for a document because I want to see if I can get my wording here correctly because I worked at it a bit, to a magazine being published looking at the impact of blockchain. Well, I'm going to have to go from memory. And what was the meaning of blockchain? And what I said was that wherever people, processes, businesses, governments, or the social good requires proof of identity or existence, ownership of assets, transactions, or contractual commitments, blockchain provides us with a capability to deliver that is orders of magnitude higher than anything we've ever had previously.
And so here I think is where my conceptual, where I start to get a little confused. And I think that it's becoming clearer to me now, from our conversation through some of the research that I did before we, jumped onto the call together. And that's that, blockchain in itself is kind of the pipes, for the want of a better word, kind of what makes a lot of things possible. But then there are technologies that are built upon blockchain. So it's not that blockchain itself is what's, enabling the flow of information or the transaction, but it's the technology behind it that does, that you're then building other things on top of it. And that's what almost brings the interface, like the user interface that enables you to actually do things upon blockchain. Is that kind of right in how I'm understanding it?
Well, that's certainly true because, the internet is fine and the internet is used for lots of things. It's used for email. It's used for file transfer, a number of other technical activities that can be done on the internet that most people don't get directly involved with. But email and the World Wide Web are application systems that sit on top of the internet infrastructure. For that matter, the blockchain sits on top of the internet infrastructure, but then many other things can, if you will, sit on top of the blockchain. So you're exactly correct. You have to have applications of a variety of types. You have to have systems that organizations use, what are sometimes referred to back office systems that are significant record keeping or transaction processing systems that can leverage the power of the blockchain. And of course, then these systems at appropriate points have to have user interfaces, whether those are user interfaces for business people that are, or organizational management, governmental management, what have you, that are using these systems to sort of manage large-scale operations, or whether they're interfaces for us as individual consumers, constituents, or what have you, to be able to, interact with those systems on our own behalf.
So when I think about procurement then, and maybe more broadly supply chain, I've read a lot about smart contracts. And, maybe that's just because that's in the news right now, and that's the one that jumps out as this is a way that, procurement can take advantage of applications built upon blockchain technology. I had a couple of questions related to that. One, if you could just share a little bit about what a smart contract is, but also, what are some of the other use cases of where blockchain can actually be used to improve the way that a company buys? Because I want to try and make this real from a procurement perspective.
Absolutely, and I think that's an excellent point. So let me answer the second question first. There's a variety of ways that you can use the blockchain to help facilitate the broader procurement process. If we add into procurement the related activities of sourcing, supply chain management, logistics, and so forth, taking the broadest possible look at the field, a number of things. One of the most exciting is I mentioned that blockchain, because it keeps an immutable record, and it's an immutable time-stamped record. What that means is at exactly any point in time who owned a given asset, whether that is a Bitcoin, for example, or whether it's some kind of part or material or product that was created. So the whole issue of provenance in supply chain management is becoming increasingly important in many fields. In the pharmaceutical industry, for example, they need to know who owned all the various different chemicals and biologicals that are used, who created them. We bought this from X at this point in time. What circumstances were they transported under? For example, that's where the Internet of Things can come in, where sensors embedded in a truck or an aircraft or a pallet or what have you can do such things as keep track of temperature, humidity, pressure, other relevant information. And so the provenance of those materials, provenance can come into play in the, especially for electronic or digital products of many types. So many products now incorporate electronic capabilities into them. The last thing that a chief procurement officer wants to see is that there is, Greenpeace or some other group picketing the corporate headquarters because they have discovered that the company's supplier's supplier has a supplier whose supplier is buying raw materials from a conflict minerals area that is using, slave labor, child labor, violating all the international treaties and societal norms in order to increase their profits, and they're changing the books. And by the time it gets 2 or 3 levels below the company, it looks like all those parts and materials have been perfectly legitimate. They're buying primary assemblies of the product they're, finally assembling and delivering into the market. Suddenly, they're being accused of supporting all kinds of awful activities. With the blockchain, you could have a complete record going all the way back to the extractive industry to verify exactly where did that come from. That is already being done, for example, in the diamond industry to get away from the use of blood diamonds.
So it's bringing complete transparency, or it can bring complete transparency to the entire supply chain.
It can absolutely do that. And it can also be done for indirect procurement in the procurement of services, for instance. How do we know that person X working for company Y is in fact certified by, let's say, the Federal Aviation Administration to work on an airplane engine for outsourced services, or whatever might be an appropriate certification authority? And, well, they send you a copy of this document. All right, the copy looks right. Has anybody ever forged a document like that? People forge documents all the time. It's not a very large percentage, but it happens. And so, again, when we evolve to the point, which will not take very long, where these certification authorities provide digital certification that is on the blockchain, and now what you get is access to a blockchain record that you can see was signed by the Federal Aviation Administration or whatever is the relevant certification authority, then you know that that person is somebody who's qualified to deliver the kind of service that you're looking to procure.
So how about the smart contract then? And, again, I probably come back to that probably more than anything because it has the word contract in it. So I can make the easiest jump to procurement.
And procurement professionals, spend a lot of time dealing with contracts and the necessary adjunct to contracts, which is lawyers and attorneys. And so what do we mean by a smart contract? Well, the idea is that because you have an immutable record stored on the blockchain, you could store your contract out there. Well, a simplistic example would be simply to, once you've agreed on a contract and you've applied a digital signature of some kind, that you store a copy of the contract on the blockchain that you've both agreed to, and nobody has to get into any issues or questions about, well, which version of the contract was the final one we agreed on. We've got it stored out there. It's signed by both parties or all the parties, and we can all easily reference the one true source of information about that contract. That in and of itself, of course, has a certain amount of value. But because it's stored out on the blockchain, the contract can also be dynamic. And by dynamic, I mean it can function as a computer program. And by functioning as a computer program, it can take in information about events or status of other information. And like any other computer program, it can then trigger the sharing of information or even certain actions to take place that people have agreed upon contractually. Let me give you a very simple example of this. There's a smart contract out there which you can use to purchase late airplane flight delay insurance. And what you do, there's an app out there, and sorry, I don't remember the name of the app, but a quick Google would let you find it if you're interested. And what the app will do is you pay any amount of money you want to ensure that your flight is not going to be late. Let's say $100. And if your flight takes off within 45 minutes, then it's on time and you've spent $100 for insurance, and the eventuality you were insuring against didn't occur, so your $100 is gone. But then again, your flight left on time, and you're happy about that. If your flight is delayed more than 45 minutes, and how does the smart contract know that the flight is delayed more than 45 minutes? It checks the official FAA registration of flight departures. And anyone that's delayed more than 45 minutes, anybody who bought the insurance on that flight gets paid 3 times the amount of the insurance it's bought. So if your flight is delayed an hour, you get paid $300. So you get some compensation for your inconvenience. And if your flight is completely canceled, you get paid 10x, in this case, $1,000 for the even greater inconvenience that you've had undergo. So that's a very simple example of a smart contract. And more complex examples can certainly be put in place and have been put in place in various different proofs of concept and various different applications that are being developed. We are still at the very early stages of smart contracts. I've met and talked with some of the leading attorneys in the country who are knowledgeable about blockchain and smart contracts. Much of what is typically done in a smart contract works very much like a computer program, because contracts are basically a series of logical statements that says, well, if this happens, then here's what's going to happen. And if this takes place, then here's this other thing that could happen, and an agreement upon a series of potential events or outcomes and the results that would take place. You know, in the simplest case, if I agree I'm going to buy widgets from you, and if I accept delivery of the widgets and agree that you sent me the number and type and quality I was expecting, I'm going to pay you a certain amount of money within a certain amount of time, and set up Boolean logical statements like that. Where we tend to get a little bit hung up at this point is still the contracts are not fully legally enforceable, in the sense that they typically don't yet include things like the clauses about, in the event of litigation, what jurisdiction will that litigation take place in, and that sort of thing. But we've managed to work around those challenges all the way back to the days of electronic data interchange in the 1980s, and then with the emergence of electronic commerce starting in the late 90s and right on up to the present day, in terms of resolving those kinds of contractual issues, and when there has been litigation, validating that where there was a clearly communicated and clearly agreed upon set of legal conditions that happen to be done in electronic form rather than traditional paper and wet ink, that can be as legally binding as if it were in more traditional forms. So I have no question that, you know, as the practice grows and as attorneys continue to stay actively involved in refining the development and application of smart contracts, that they will become more and more broadly used.
I'm not sure if it's taking a step back or taking a step up, but what I want to do is I want to try and make something, you know, actionable. So we talked about the fact that blockchain and the technologies that are being built upon blockchain, you know, probably in their early stages in terms of, you know, the cycle of adoption. But there are use cases out there. You know, you talked about some of the use cases out there. So there's obviously ways that people who are listening, procurement professionals, procurement leaders, could actually start exploring, you know, how do we start almost dipping the toe in the water to learn a little bit more and to see firsthand the benefits that blockchain can bring. Where can they start? You know, is there something that maybe there's some use cases which are just, I don't want to say no-brainers, but are what would highlight themselves as being great pilots? Or is it just at this stage more about information and learning? You know, what do you recommend to people who ask, okay, what can I do about this? And what can I do about it today? I
recommend education and strategic planning. And in fact, that's why we organized the American Blockchain Council. The American Blockchain Council is a not-for-profit organization whose mission is to help senior executives, and especially non-technical senior executives, to understand the strategic implications of blockchain technology. And in order to address that mission, we are providing communication and education. So one of the things that I would encourage people to do is, over the last 10 months, we have grown the Blockchain Executive LinkedIn group to over 1,600 senior level executives and blockchain professionals around the world. And so that is one place where you've got an excellent source of information. There's a lot of blockchain groups LinkedIn groups around blockchain, but many of them are either highly technical or very narrowly focused in specific industry verticals. Blockchain Executive is one of the few that I'm aware of that is actually consciously trying to reach out to senior level executives and help them understand the business applications, the use cases for blockchain in multiple different industries, multiple fields, procurement certainly, but also related areas such as finance, operations, human resources, what have you. So that's one easy to do, easy to use thing. We also are providing what we call blockchain executive seminars and blockchain executive briefings for organizations, individual companies and organizations, that is, groups like trade associations, professional societies, and these range anywhere from an hour to a full day, depending on the forum, the group, their needs, interests, and so forth, all about educating about blockchain and what it means from a business perspective. One of the most important things that we try to communicate to people is to be thinking long-term and strategically. One of the things I've learned as a technology futurist over the years is that the mistake that is all too often made by people and organizations when they encounter a new emerging technology is to say, well, maybe this has got some potential for us. Let's do a business case analysis and see if we can determine what kind of ROI we might generate if we implemented this technology. The problem is there's often an unstated assumption, and the unstated assumption is assuming that this is the only thing we do different and everything else about our business model, business processes, infrastructure, systems, and so forth stays exactly identical to the way it is today, and we take this one new technology and slap it on the outside of it. What kind of benefits are we going to get? And all too often the conclusion is, well, in a few areas here and there, we'll get some marginal benefits, and maybe it's worth pursuing and maybe it's not. And in many cases, the conclusion is, well, let's just wait around a little longer before we decide whether we really need to understand this and get more deeply involved. And the strategic error is that's not the way the real world works. In the real world, emerging technologies, processes, systems, infrastructure are continually evolving. And that really makes a challenge for procurement executives and executives in any other field. Because how do you go about thinking about the potential impact of multiple different emerging technologies all at the same time on your business and plan for that impact at the same time that you're trying to keep today's business structure, processes, systems operating and fixing short-term problems and making near-term operational improvements and so forth. And, it's the old thing, how do you change the wheels on the car while you're driving down the road? What we have found works most effectively in doing that is a technique that is often referred to as third horizon planning. And it takes much longer to execute than I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest condensed version of. But basically it works like this. The notion of first horizon planning is your traditional sort of annual plan that most companies go through. What do we need to do in terms of making short-term operational improvements, added efficiencies, expansions, extensions of our existing, processes, product line, what have you. And, what do we need to do? You and I are talking in mid-March of 2017. What do we need to be doing through the end of 2017, maybe on to into 2018? That's good as far as it goes. But what you also need to be able to think about in parallel to that is what we call the third horizon. And the third horizon is looking out several years. And depending on the size and complexity of your organization, it's going to be a minimum of 2 or 3 years. It may be 5 to as many as 7 years out. So, we're talking about looking out to, from this vantage point, somewhere in the range of 2020 to even 2025. And the reason you need to look out a few years is you need to say, you know what, we need a time cushion because there's only so much you can do in the next year. But if we're looking out 3 to 5 years or more, we could change any key business process, even our underlying business model. We could change significantly our IT infrastructure, our systems, our applications. We're no longer constrained about, well, we can't do this because it would require too much time and effort and money to change this, that, or the other thing. Okay, so you have a vision of how do we still leverage the capabilities, resources, and core competencies of our organization, but envision that in operating as a series of digital processes within a digital business model and a broader digital ecosystem. This is what the term digital transformation really refers to. Rethinking everything and leveraging all of these emerging technologies. And then how could we leverage blockchain, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, and even tools like augmented reality, 3D printing, advanced analytics, robotic manufacturing, and we could go on and on. How might we picture that all of these things could be brought to bear in a dramatically different environment that many find ourselves looking in? And what you're likely going to do is you may come up with 2 or 3 or 4 different scenarios where you could see various different technologies coming into play, various ways of rethinking your business model and processes, all of which, though, still leverage your core competencies, resources, markets, your underlying sort of fundamental mission and capabilities as an organization. And then, okay, fine. So you pick the best one or the best couple of those and say, well, what would it take to get from here to there? And there's 2 kinds of things. In this digital vision of the future that you've got a few years out there, you're going to be doing many of the same things that you're already doing today. You may be doing them in very different ways, but you're still going to do those functions or activities. But some of the things you're doing today will be able to go away. For example, with blockchain technology, the way the audit function works is going to be completely transformed. There'll still be an audit capability that needs to be done, but it's going to be done in such a radically different way that you could think of today's audit function as going away and being replaced by a new kind of digital audit function based on the blockchain. Again, I don't get too much into the details of how that would work, but there are already CPA firms, leading thinkers in the field, looking at how that's going to happen. So some of the things you're doing today, you won't need to do anymore, especially a lot of the record keeping will be done in very different ways. But you're also going to want to do some things to take full advantage of all these technologies. You're going to want to do some things that you don't have the time or resources to do today because it's going to be capable for you to deliver more value faster at lower cost. And so you're going to want to do some new things. So that gives you the perspective to think about the strategic planning process in 2 ways. One, it says, you know what? For those parts of our current system that we think will still be things that we're doing, what is the evolutionary path going to need to be to get from there to where we envision being, say, 5 years from now? And for those things that we think we might not be doing anymore, how much do we really want to invest in improving or changing those? I mean, we may need to still do a few things of fixes here and there, make sure that they keep working until we're ready to replace them with something better, but we probably don't want to spend a whole lot of time and money on something that we think in a few years is going to go away completely anyway. The other piece of it is, how do you plan for the things that you're not yet doing? And those are the areas where you're going to be either leveraging new technologies like blockchain, AI, Internet of Things, and what have you, or you're going to be incorporating the current and new technologies into radically different processes or business models. And that's where you set up what has often been referred to as a skunk works kind of a capability. You set aside a certain amount of resources to enable you to test and develop and learn, how do these technologies work? And if we were to implement a process that worked in this particular way, and maybe you do it on a very small scale, proof of concept kind of thing, how well would that work? Would that serve the needs? And you try to isolate that from the short-term financial and operational pressures of your first horizon sort of routine business activities, so that you learn and you develop the skill sets in these updated processes and working with these new technologies. And as you revise and refine those, that's your second horizon activities. As you revise and refine those second horizon activities over the succeeding year or 2 or 3, they evolve, get better, more useful, more effective. Meanwhile, the first horizon activities that you're going to be retaining continue to evolve. And at some point down the road, a few years, eventually those 2 merge together into what is effectively become your third horizon vision of where you want to be. Now, again, even that's somewhat simplified because you still need to step back every year or so and say, hey, is the third horizon vision that we had in mind a year ago still what we think we want to be doing 3 or 4 or 5 years out from now? And so it's a continuously evolving process. But that's the way. It's not so much, well, where do we shoehorn blockchain or any other technology in today's processes? It's how do we take an overall strategic view of these digital capabilities, one of the most important of which, but certainly by no means the only one of which that's important, is blockchain technology.
Yeah. It's about building that roadmap then. So taking into account all the different things and the impact they can have on their business, taking that blue sky kind of thinking approach and then building a roadmap of how to get there.
Exactly. And, that's exactly very well put.
Well, Jack, I know that we're kind of bouncing against the top of the hour here, so I feel like we've only scratched the surface. I also feel there's so much more to kind of talk about and to maybe go a little bit deeper. And I'd love to do that again on hopefully another show, because I think there's so much potential impact on what we do as a profession, but not just on what we do as in our isolated kind of view of the world of procurement, but how it actually impacts what a company buys, how a company buys. And obviously we need to be at the forefront of that to help our organizations kind of through that minefield. It's on us to take a leading role in helping our company understand the things that are coming from the outside and how we can take advantage of it.
I agree completely, and it would be absolutely a pleasure to do another session perhaps down the road in a few months to update people to some of the recent developments and maybe drill a little deeper into some of these topics.
No, that would be fantastic. So my last question is just the easy one. And I just want to give listeners the opportunity to reach out, connect with you personally, or to find some of your work where they can learn a little bit more. So where would you point them to? Where can they go?
Okay, well, I've already mentioned the Blockchain Executive LinkedIn group. People are certainly absolutely welcome to reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn. I have the American Blockchain Council has a webpage on which you can add your name to our mailing list if you would choose to do that. It's AmericanBlockchainCouncil.org. Because I do a lot of speaking to procurement executives and other kinds of executives, not only on blockchain, but also on other kinds of emerging technologies, then I have a separate speaking website, and that is www.ecom.com, and that's spelled with a hyphen, e-com.com. So, and you can email me, jshaw@americanblockchain.org, and just say you heard me on the Art of Procurement, and you can expect a response just as quickly as I can, which is normally, worst case, within a business day or two, and faster if possible.
What I'll do is for listeners who, they're driving, they're in the gym, I'm going to make a note of those. I'm going to include them at the show notes page for today's episode. That's going to be at artofprocurement.com/blockchain 2017. That's artofprocurement.com/blockchain 2017. And Jack, just for one last time, thank you for joining me.
It's absolutely been a pleasure, Philip. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.